Hey team, I'm Ash Kelly. This is I Am Madeline, episode 4. So this is the first episode we haven't managed to release on time, and I'm blaming the heat. Here in BC on the west coast of Canada, we've had temperatures 25 degrees above average for days. It's more than 40 degrees Celsius in the sun. It's fair to say we're all moving, even thinking a little slower. And heat waves, as many of you know, impact some people a lot more than others. The inadequately housed, those of us who are older with mobility issues, and of course, people with complex health issues. It doesn't help that these issues of equality also overlap with poverty, and therefore access to relief like air conditioning, fans, and a sudden loss of access to treatments, because leaving the house right now isn't an option for a lot of people. While my housemates and I have been chugging bougie cans of sparkling water, I've been thinking about Madeline. She tells me she's okay so far. She has air conditioning and has had for a while now because her body already struggles to regulate temperature. But I think about her heading out to a treatment in this heat and the energy cost, the pain that would result in, combined with the fact that she will receive fewer treatments this week as we have a national holiday coming up and her naturopathic providers aren't even open for business. But there was some good news this week, too. On Saturday, Madeline received a donation from some friends who had canceled their travel plans because of the ongoing pandemic. They put some of their savings for that trip into her GoFundMe account, and now she knows she can keep getting treatments at least until the end of July. And I heard from a listener who also has myalgic encephalomyelitis and who also benefits from the same IV vitamin and nutrient injections known as the Myers cocktail, which Madeline relies on to stay alive. The difference is this listener has private health insurance, and as a person with disability on income assistance, Madeline's only healthcare insurance is provided by the government. So this listener has access to the same treatment being covered, and she's decided to make a donation to Madeline's GoFundMe, which, thank you. But I just want to pause and recognize these two experiences. Two people with the same disease in the same province with two totally different realities. Madeline under the care of government, begging for coverage of naturopathic treatments or any way to make sure that she has enough money to just not die. And this listener who is covered by extended health care, receiving the same treatment without the same level of dire financial despair. Madeline facing an untimely medically assisted death, avoidable if she's lifted out of poverty. And this listener who so easily could have landed where Madeline is, but luckily had employer health benefits. The difference between life and death in Canada seems to be cash flow.
It's not like I have terminal cancer. I have a mitochondrial disorder, and treatments exist in the world. I know they work for me, but because I don't have the money, they might as well not exist. I mean, for the love of God, by June, it'll be about $35,000 of medical debt that I don't know how I'd ever pay back, even if treatment, even if coverage came through, I get to go bankrupt. Like I'm a criminal, And I felt bad about that, but I also didn't want to be dead. And I could get to not want to be dead.
Today's episode is about medically assisted death, which we used to call medical assisted suicide. And I want to start by saying people with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome as it was formerly known, and fibromyalgia experience a higher rate of suicide than the general healthy population. We know this because studies from all over the world have shown it. In Canada, there is help, and it can be found 24/7 by calling the Canada Suicide Prevention Team at 1-833-456-4566. You can also text 45645 to chat with someone between 4 p.m. and midnight. We can't tell this story without touching on suicide in general. Just last week, Heidi Farrer, who was a writer on the hit 90s television show Dawson's Creek, took her own life after fighting long-haul COVID for 13 months. She died on her 50th birthday. And we also know long-haul COVID is post-viral syndrome. It is myalgic encephalomyelitis.
Most COVID patients fully recover, but not all. Experts believe at least 10% of patients become COVID long haulers who suffer severe symptoms indefinitely. A well-known Hollywood screenwriter was one of them. After fighting the virus for more than a year and experiencing endless setbacks, she died by suicide at the end of May. and her husband, Nick Gutta, joins us now. Nick, we're so sorry for your loss.
You know, based on the video she left for us, she indicated she wanted to go out while she still had some, I don't know, dignity, I guess. It's the best way I can explain it. I did ask her to hang on.
She wanted you to get her story out. What's your message to our viewers?
Well, the message to people with long haul is hang on. I believe that help is on the way, but we need our government to step in now.
The reasons most people with ME give for their suicidality is that stigma is constantly lobbed at this disease, and that creates hopelessness, profound isolation and prejudice, the loss of jobs, relationships, friendships. It's not just the experience of chronic pain or deterioration that is pushing people to end their lives. It's a lack of medical support, a lack of palliative care, and a lack of guarantee that long-term residential homes are safe. There's no access to home care, and many people with ME live in deep poverty. Again, I think it's really important to note that Madeline has not given up. In fact, I see her fighting harder than ever for coverage, for recognition, and for change. But so far, she hasn't gotten anywhere with the government. So she is allowed to die of medically assisted death as of July 11th. She qualifies under this clause of intolerable suffering. She calls it quality of life. Basically, it's one of two categories people in Canada are now able to qualify for assisted dying under. The other is that you're already considered in foreseeable death. And Madeline says she is in foreseeable death because when her treatments stop, she crashes and likely dies. The federal government tells us most people with ME/CFS are not considered to be in foreseeable death. But we've heard from a lot of patients who feel that isn't accurate.
It's like, dude, you don't know what foreseeable death looks like in my illnesses because you've done no research. You don't do autopsies on us. You know, you just pat us on the head and tell us it's objective.
And Madeline's had to settle for this category of intolerable suffering. And that means she's had to wait 90 days before she can follow through with her assisted death. That's July 11th. She can decide at any point not to follow through with this plan, but that would be a moot point if she doesn't have any way to pay for treatment. So since her GoFundMe started in November, it's been this terrible roller coaster, an exercise in constant calculations as donations trickle in. You know, she spent about 2 months thinking that her cash would run out in June. And now, because of recent donations, she's looking at the end of July. It comes in spurts, and then for weeks, there will be no donations. And when we talk about allowing people to die because their quality of life is low, as in allowing them to choose death, we have to recognize that especially in wealthy countries like Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, we have the ability, we have the wealth to give people a better quality of life. And our federal government has long stated its commitment to increase end-of-life care and home care. The money seems to be flying around. Billions of dollars have been transferred to the provinces for these purposes. But on the ground, it seems like nothing has changed. Otherwise, why wouldn't Madeline have home care? Why do people with disabilities still receive dismal medical coverage? And at the same time, our medical assistance in dying legislation has been opened wide open to be available to more people, including people who qualify under this category of so-called intolerable suffering. Despite clear and loud calls for alternative health supports to be in place alongside those laws. The legislation and ethical debate surrounding the right to die has a long and controversial history in Canada, and my co-producer Kelvin Gawley has been good enough to dig into this for us over the last 2 weeks. Kelvin, what have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting and difficult subject. There's so much passion on all sides of this debate. And it's one of those issues that really cuts so much deeper than most political issues. It is a political issue, but it's also an ethical issue. For a lot of people, it's a religious or spiritual issue. And it's one of those kind of vexing questions, right? Who gets to decide when somebody gets to die? What kind of protection should there be? It's not just this ethereal, philosophical question. It's something that really comes down to earth because it's an issue of life and death. And, you know, for Madeline, it's literally about when she's going to die and how she's going to die and her decision to have autonomy over it.
If you were in a room in a burning building and there were flames between you and the door, and there were flames all throughout the building,
and you were 50 stories up, and you could get the window open, and you can feel the breeze, smell the air, and see the sunshine, and see the world. But the flames are behind you, and you know if you jump, you won't survive. So do you burn to death, or do you jump? Or do you take a moment before the flames get to you and enjoy the world with all that sadness and anger at having to leave?
Madeline's personal experience with MAID is both very individual and also perhaps can help us glean why we have these laws, why people have fought long and hard for the right to die, and why people are still fighting for further protections in Canada. So, I mean, honestly, given how wide this topic is, where do we even start?
I want to start by just laying out some terminology, make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the vocabulary we're going to be using here. So the term you've heard us probably use in this podcast is medical assistance in dying, MAID, which is the acronym for that. So that medical assistance in dying is the official legal term in Canada since it's been legalized a few years ago. And basically, it's exactly like what it sounds like. You're choosing to die and you're getting help with the doctor. Here in Canada, there's a number of parameters that one has to meet in order to qualify, and we're going to get into that. But for now, just know that is the legal official term here in Canada. Medical assistance in dying is a form of assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is the more broad term, and it can apply to this, medical assistance in dying, but it can also apply to things that have historically and continue to be illegal. So, for example, you have a friend who's expressed suicidal thoughts, and you say, okay, yeah, I'll help you, and you drive them to a bridge, something like that.
So with Madeline, I made the mistake a couple times of saying she's scheduled to die specifically. And that really taught me that language is important here. She's not scheduled to die. She is allowed to die after a certain date. Most importantly, she's allowed to not die, to choose not to die, should she have some alternative medical plan for her. I mean, she's allowed to choose not to die for any reason, but realistically, the only thing that would, I think, empower her to do that is if she had the cash to pay for her treatments.
Yeah, and she's addressed this with us, a number of times, really laying out the reality of this, just the decision and sort of the limited choices in front of her right now.
None of this needed to happen, but we have never been given enough money to take care of any of our health challenges, and that there's not even a category of coverage for post-viral syndrome and its constituent elements of mitochondrial disorder, fibromyalgia, multiple chemical sensitivity, and immune deficiency or immune malfunction. Mine's a deficiency. There's no way I ever had a shot. And to me, it's really hard for me not to feel like this is all my country's way, and especially the medical system's way of saying, hurry up and die.
And it comes back to this question of what is really a free choice? If the other options are crap, if the option is, living in a care home where it's underfunded and you're not getting adequate care, is that really a free choice? If it's between that and medically assisted death. So we did find this, this one report about what has happened with MAID. This federal report, and it does show, the numbers certainly increase. In 2016, the year it became legal, just over 1,000 people died by MAID. The next year it was about 2,800. In 2018, it was 4,400, and then 2019 it was 5,600. So it's increasing bit by bit every year, and it did follow quite closely to the kind of statistics we've seen in other countries. The survey found that 40% of MAID patients reported needing some form of disability support, needing a form of technology, equipment, rehab services, and also disability income supports. So of the 40% of MAID patients who said they needed disability supports, 90% said they got some. Now, that doesn't really answer the big question here, though, right? And the report does actually address this quite explicitly. Here's a quote. While this data does provide insight into whether or not supportive services are made available to persons seeking MAID, it does not provide insight into the adequacy of the services offered. And that reminds me of that Maclean's piece from last year. Gabrielle Peters, she's a local disabled writer here in Vancouver, and she wrote this pretty incredible Maclean's piece. You read that, right?
I read it, and actually Madeline is mentioned in it. And there's an article that Peters wrote a few months after that first one. It's another woman here in Vancouver. She's at the GF Strong Rehabilitation Clinic, and she's just at the beginning of her recovery journey from a major injury that left her paraplegic. So it's this life-altering injury, but it was not a life-threatening injury. And there's and basically she's being offered medical assistance in dying by her healthcare team. And the social assumptions that we're making that's just the right choice for you. That's where you should be landing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another statistic that I think kind of relates here. In that same report, it was the first annual report into MAID in Canada and its implementation. So one of the things that they asked, they sort of did a survey of MAID patients, and one of the things they asked is to sort of quantify or sort of relate the nature of their suffering. So about 80% of people said that they were unable to meaningfully engage in sort of the general living of life, going out, being with family and stuff like that, but also just in the day-to-day life of, I believe that means, feeding yourself, going to the washroom and stuff like that. There's a few other things listed, but the one that really jumped out to me was this, here's how they named it: perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers. And a third, 34% of people checked that box.
They feel they've inconvenienced their family, their friends, their caregivers by existing.
Yeah. And that's not just, a feeling that they've expressed. It's a feeling that they have said is one of the things that's making them suffer and is the reason they're seeking MAID. There was more than one scenario like that where it was this guy that sent this audio to CTV, right? He recorded some of the hospital staff that seemed to suggest that he was also just better off dead.
Yeah, we're talking about Roger Foley there. I think CBC did an article, but there wasn't like a big pickup. But when I read it, like it's a really clear example of something that should have been a bit outrageous that Canadians would want to know about. So he's in hospital, and he says in his time in hospital he gets food poisoning. He is injured from the care the inadequate care he's alleging he's receiving, and he decides, I want to go home and be in charge of my own care. I'd like to go home and be in charge of who I hire to take care of me. He figures this is a right. So he files a lawsuit to this end. And in it, he names this Ontario hospital in London, a number of health agencies he's involved with, and obviously the Ontario government and the federal government. And he says, health officials will not provide me with assisted home care. Instead, they've offered me medically assisted death. Of course, he says he's not the one who brought this up. This is not his idea. This is Foley in hospital, and this is what his doctor is telling him.
In this case, I am assured that Brent and our legal team would have reviewed whether or not it is applicable. We do not use this conversation in every situation. It is only in situations where somebody has a plan in the community that is feasible, that they're not going to accept, and that's okay.
Wait. You just said there's a plan, so I haven't been informed of what the plan is and what the planning was. I haven't been a part of it. You just violated my rights under the Home Care Bill of Rights, the participation right. You've already violated my preferences and also reprisals. So what's the plan that you know of?
Roger, this is not my show. I told you my piece of this was to talk to you about if you had interest in assisted dying.
How are you feeling, Raj? Are you feeling like you want to harm yourself or anything like that?
Well, I'm always thinking I want to end my life because of the way things are going. If I had self-directed funding, then I'd be fine,
But if you weren't, you can just apply to get an assisted. If you want to end your life, you don't have to do it in some dramatic manner. You can apply for assisted,
Well, they already presented an outcome option to me, but it's like, why force me to end my life when...
Oh, no, hang on here. I'm saying if you feel that way, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm saying I don't want you to be here and wanting to take your life in some, if you're having these thoughts, because you always have these thoughts.
Well, because I'm trapped. It's my intolerable suffering is due to the system creating it. I want out of that system. I need self-directed funding, and
yes, but that's something that you're continuing to fight.
Yeah, I'm fighting for my life.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is, don't be rash, and I don't want you to be here because I've noticed that you don't want any forks or knives or anything here. So I don't want you to be doing anything rash.
Was when the hospital threatens me and puts me through rough treatment.
But I'm not here to defend the hospital because it's neither here nor there. But there's no one else I know who's been in the hospital for 2 years.
What?
No one else that I know who's been in the hospital for this amount of time.
And we hear all the time about the cost of healthcare. So this sort of sentiment of being a burden, to me, brings up the report that I found, which was it was a Parliamentary Budget Office report that came out around the same time as the most recent medical assistance in dying legislation was being written. And it looked at basically how much money Canada would save by administering MAID. So here's a quote I pulled up. The predicted gross reduction in healthcare costs amounts to $109.2 million, while the cost of administering MAID is estimated at $22.3 million. Thus, the difference between the two represents a net cost reduction for provincial governments of $86.9 million.
It's kind of vulgar to see, just like the human life just reduced to just a couple line items in a budget or in a budget report.
Even putting out a report like that, like a PBO, Parliamentary Budget Office report that says the more people we just let die and die sooner, the more money we'll have in our country, period. Like what I just feels like such an inappropriate and ableist way to look at our budget and to look at the issue. And Madeline's made this point too.
I've given this a lot of thought that if you give PWD money, it's like putting it in a hole in the ground. And it isn't. It's an economic stimulus. I need people to help me. I need a housekeeper. I need pre-made meals. This is prescribed by a hospital to me. This is what you need. They prescribe just baseline supplements for mild ME, not for what I'm going through. But
it's, if there were going to be a PBO report on the cost savings of MAID, it should, I think, also consider that injecting disability assistance at a level above the poverty line would be an economic stimulus. Like, this is not a holistic look at the economic issue of healthcare. It will cost more money to keep people like Madeline in a care home for the final years of their lives than it would be to increase their assistance and or increase their medical coverage.
I was like, dude, there's this thing that really helps and I can't afford it. And it would, prevent me from deteriorating. And if I wasn't looking at just such a catastrophic failure. I mean, I know many people in my situation would choose to go into a care home, and that's totally fine. I mean, everybody needs to do their process and do what's right for them. So if that was the case for me, then it would be so expensive for the government. It would cost way more than any of the treatments combined that I'm asking for.
This gives us a foundation of where we're going, but you're going to take us back to the beginning. Tell us about where assisted death and this debate actually starts in Canada, as far as we know.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few big events sort of on this topic in Canadian history that I think a lot of Canadians are at least somewhat familiar with, and we're going to get to those. The court cases, Sue Rodriguez, Robert Latimer. But I want to go back just a little bit further to the mid-'80s. It's the AIDS epidemic. Lots of people are dying across the world and in Canada, especially in the gay community. And somebody that sort of had a front row to that was a man by the name of Sven Robinson. He was an MP from Burnaby, a New Democrat. A woman came into his constituency office and she told him about her son. Her son was at university at Carleton in Ottawa, but he had HIV and he was dying of AIDS. And there was a hospice in Ottawa run by the Catholic Church, the Elizabeth Bruyere Hospice, and they refused to admit him. So she asked Sven to help, and he did. He made a big stink about it in Parliament, and Mitch was, I think, the first AIDS patient to be admitted to this hospice. So Robinson got him into the hospice, and he began to visit him very regularly as he was getting sicker and sicker and declining. And something, that Mitch told Sven in this hospice really stuck with him.
And he had a room that looked out over the Ottawa River and looked across to Hull and the bridge there. And one day he just said to me, look, Sven, I wish to God I'd known it was going to be like this at the end, because I wouldn't have wanted to live like this. And I would have jumped off that bridge. And it just struck me. My God, what a terrible way to end your life. Suffering, being treated in a way as a pariah, and not having any option, knowing that you're going to die soon, to end it.
And sadly, Mitch wasn't alone. This was a kind of a situation that Robinson had seen with friends in his community.
It was AIDS that really brought this to my attention. I had gay friends who had terrible experiences and had tried to end their life, took overdoses of medication. The human body is very resilient, and they didn't succeed. In some cases, they were left in a vegetative state.
So Mitch died in 86, and Robinson never really forgot it. In the following years, he became an outspoken advocate for assisted suicide, for legalizing assisted suicide, which was illegal in all contexts at the time. And so he was speaking up publicly about this, and he eventually made contact with this group that was also pushing for legalizing assisted suicide. It was the Right to Die Society. And they introduced him to a woman named Sue Rodriguez. Ash, does that name mean anything to you?
Sue is the first name that comes to mind for me after Madeline these days when I think about assisted suicide. I guess I know who she is because we were taught about this in school, in high school, and we learned a lot about, Sue's personal battle and that she fought through the worst of her illness right up to the Supreme Court for a dignified death.
Sven, he highlighted just that to me, the way in which she chose to use the last years and months of her life as she was deteriorating, as her ALS was getting worse by the day.
Probably the most courageous person I've ever met. She was diagnosed with ALS, with Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I think it was 91. And it was a particularly aggressive form of ALS. So she knew she didn't have a lot of time left. She had a young son and a husband, and she just decided that in whatever time she had left, she wanted to devote every ounce of her energy and her strength, remaining strength, to changing a law that she and I both saw as profoundly cruel and unjust.
So Rodriguez decided to sue. She wanted to sue the Canadian government because she believed they were violating her basic charter rights. So there was a number of arguments she made related to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. One was that it is legal to commit suicide in Canada. It was legalized in the 70s. So if you're an able-bodied person and you commit suicide or you attempt to commit suicide, that is not a crime. But assisted suicide is illegal. So it's illegal to try to help someone to kill themselves. So she's saying an able-bodied person can use, a number of different methods to end their life, but I cannot. And as my condition is deteriorating, as I'm no longer physically capable of doing a number of different things, an able-bodied person can do it. I cannot because of the law, so therefore I'm being discriminated against. Another thing she was arguing is that the laws as they existed violated her charter rights. I think there was Section 12, which protects you against cruel and unusual treatment. And here's what she said sort of about the way that she was being subjected to what she called torture.
If my suffering was being inflicted upon me in any other context, it would be called an abuse of human rights and might well be called a crime. But because it happens in the name of modern medicine, I'm supposed to accept whatever indignities my illness inflicts upon me and keep quiet.
So the first lawsuit was filed in BC Supreme Court. Rodriguez lost that, but it eventually got to the Supreme Court in Canada, which is, of course, the top court and the final decider on these sort of constitutional issues.
A long and difficult battle has come to a disappointing end for Sue Rodriguez. The woman from British Columbia has lost her court fight for the right to have a doctor help her kill herself.
5 of the 9 justices ruled that an individual's right to a dignified death does not override the sanctity of life under the law, and is not more important than the state's interest in protecting the weak and the vulnerable, people who might be persuaded or pressured to commit suicide. And therefore, Sue Rodriguez was denied the legal right to a doctor-assisted suicide.
Robinson said, this was a heartbreaking loss for him and Rodriguez. They really felt like they had the right arguments. They did have the majority of Canadians on their side at the time. Public polling showed that it was north of 70%, which is, I think it's rare to have the public agree on any kind of issue with that much strength. But this was a victory for their opponents. There were some Christian groups who felt that there's the sanctity of life and only God gets to decide when somebody dies. But there was also a number of disability advocacy groups that did oppose this. They felt that this would sort of give more credence to this societal idea that disabled people, their lives just aren't worth living and they're disposable. That settled it, at least for then. Assisted suicide was not going to become legal in Canada. Rodriguez did end up dying by assisted suicide, though. A doctor helped her die in her home. Robinson was there, but that doctor has remained anonymous. Robinson has never revealed this person's identity and has vowed to never do so because, I think it probably won't be a problem now, but at the time, that doctor was risking criminal prosecution.
After we lost that, I'll never forget, I was with Sue when we got the decision, and her words to me, she said, Sven, and her voice was weak at that point. She knew she was near the end. She said, Sven, she said, the court may have spoken, but I still have the last word, don't I? And in the end, she did have the last word.
It's this argument for medical assistance in dying is, it's this person's choice. But a lot of people say, well, is it really a free choice? If the choice is between, poverty and living in a world of ableist depression or dying, well, is that a free choice? It's not, it's not that simple. So 93 was kind of a busy year for these types of debates. Later that same year, a man by the name of Robert Latimer was in the news. He was a farmer in Saskatchewan. He had a 12-year-old daughter, Tracy, who had cerebral palsy. And when the rest of his family was at church one morning, he put her in his truck, put a hose from the exhaust into the cab, and he killed her by carbon monoxide poisoning.
It's an unusual case, one that has attracted national media attention. It's unusual for many reasons. Firstly, Latimer has admitted to killing Tracy. Secondly, the reasons he's given for doing it.
So Latimer said that this was an act of love. It was an act of compassion. According to him, she was suffering so much from this cerebral palsy that her every moment was, torture, according to him, according to Latimer. And it's kind of surprising. Maybe not, but public opinion polls were very strongly in his corner then and to this day. But, these issues of, how it was framed, her experience, her condition, the supposed pain and suffering that she was subjected to by cerebral palsy, this was all told through the eyes of Latimer, of certain lawyers and judges. It really reinforced so many of these ableist ideas of what it means to be a person with a disability. So I found this great episode of this old CBC show called DNet that unfortunately isn't around anymore. The CBC journalist Ing Wong was one of the hosts, and she did this great segment specifically about that. It wasn't about the case or, the charges or anything like that. It was about the language that we use when we talk about disability. So here's what she had to say specifically about this word suffering.
Words like suffering invoke powerful images. We went to a local Toronto shopping center to find out what those images are.
What do I think of when I hear the term suffering? Her mental anguish and physical pain that she might have been suffering could have justified, again, what he felt he had to do to help her.
For people who've never met someone with CP, the only information they have comes from the media. And if the media emphasizes suffering, then that's what shapes public perception.
The images that come to mind when you say cerebral palsy are, it's embarrassing to the person's state of mind.
It really drives home exactly, how people think about disability. This idea that, their entire existence is just suffering, and you hear that one clip of the woman in the shopping mall. She says, she's asked, what comes to mind when you think about cerebral palsy, and she said, well, it's embarrassing. Well, who's embarrassed? Are you embarrassed to I don't know, be around someone with cerebral palsy, or you're just assuming that person's embarrassed? In that clip, at one point, Ing Wong, she shows a picture of Tracy. And, she's got this great beaming smile at a birthday party. And she's like, well, her dad says she was, just suffering at every second of every moment of her life. Well, was she suffering then?
So back to Latimer. Although he did have that public support on his side, he was arrested and charged and eventually went to trial.
He was convicted of second-degree murder. He was given a 10-year sentence, a prison sentence. That conviction was appealed, and it was thrown out because the prosecutors were found to have tampered with the jury. So he got a second trial, and he was convicted again. But what the judge did there was pretty extraordinary. He granted Latimer what's called a constitutional exemption. So the 10-year sentence, that is a mandated minimum. If you're convicted of second-degree murder, you have to be sentenced to jail for a minimum of 10 years. But the judge said, no. So I'm going to take this extraordinary step, give him a constitutional exemption. He gave him a 2-year prison sentence with eligibility for parole after just 1 year. The second judge did give this kind of extraordinary sentence, and he made this argument that, this is a different thing. And he said there should be a legal category for what I want to call compassionate homicide. That's why, he should only have this 2-year sentence. But that was actually thrown out.
Oh.
Yeah. So that was this 2-year sentence. This judge gave it to him, but it was appealed, and it was thrown out, and his original 10-year sentence was reinstated. But I do bring up this ruling just because in the way it was rationalized is I think really interesting. He just goes on at length about Tracy's physical condition. He talks about the different surgeries she's had. I just want to read you a quote. So this is how he describes Latimer. He calls him a responsible and hardworking farmer, a devoted family man with a loving and caring nature, and a loving and protective parent. And he said Latimer's only concern was Tracy's ongoing pain. He said Tracy was, quote, slowly but steadily deteriorating. Cerebral palsy it's not a degenerative disease. It's not like ALS or MS or Alzheimer's, where people with it steadily get worse and worse. It's something that people are generally born with, and it's something they deal with, and I'm sure the way they deal with it can change over time, but it's not something that's degenerative. So I found this great paper by this University of Lethbridge professor, Dr. Sally Hayward, and she addressed this head on, and she talks specifically about this misconception that the judge has that he seems to have gotten from one of the lawyers. And so this judge, kind of walked in and kind of assumed that he kind of knew what was going on with Tracy and why it was basically understandable or maybe even acceptable that Latimer had killed his daughter. She goes on in this paper, Hayward writes, quote, in refusing to acknowledge the complexity of Tracy's lived experience and by speaking of her only in negative terms, Justice Noble not only constructs Tracy as an absent presence that is not quite real enough to be considered a human being, with all the rights that this implies, but establishes a way of thinking about disabled others that imagines them through the inevitability of, and indeed even the need for their, quote, compassionate deaths. So that ruling, like I said, it was thrown out. Latimer's original sentence was reinstated. Because of all these appeals and stuff, he didn't actually go to jail until 2001. It's like 8 years after killing his daughter. And years later, there was, a lot of discussion around whether he should be released on parole. He was eventually released on parole in 2007, and he's been a free man since. It just seems so clear to me that this was murder. You murdered your child, and and he benefited from such widespread ableist, views of disabled people that, it didn't seem like people really struggled to jump on his side.
With Madeline, with this conversation with Latimer, I just keep coming back to that phrase, the right to live, the right to live. And, I know that this was all in the 90s, and I know Canada didn't even legalize assisted suicide until 2016. So I'm kind of wondering what happened in between all this.
Yeah. And, as far as I can tell, it really did go on the back burner for like basically 3 decades. There was some bills, and I think Sven Robinson was involved in a few that failed in Parliament and stuff like that. But really, this didn't come right back onto the national stage until 2015, when there was a new case ahead of the Supreme Court. Is Carter v. Canada. So the name Carter, it comes from this woman named Lee Carter. She's from BC as well. And she flew to Switzerland with her mother, Kay, and her mother wanted to die, and she did die at an assisted suicide clinic in Switzerland. So technically, Lee Carter did break the law. Maybe lawyers would disagree, but it certainly seemed like she was risking prosecution for helping her mother commit suicide. She was never arrested. She was never charged, but she did, feel very strongly that this was unethical, that this was the way that she had to do things.
Her health was deteriorating fairly quickly, and she said, I'm done. I'd like to move on, and it should be my choice.
There's 2 other plaintiffs in this case, Elaine Chapret, an MS patient from Vancouver, and she also was, had similar arguments to Rodriguez back in the day.
I cannot move or turn over in bed. In effect, I'm a prisoner of my own body. I no longer consider my life worth living unless I possess the means to leave it at the time of my choosing.
And then the lead plaintiff in this case was Gloria Taylor. Again, a woman from BC. Like Rodriguez, she had ALS, and she also, she said she just felt that this decision of when she died should be up to her, and that she should have access to the help of a doctor when the time came.
I'm dying piece by piece, and I'm asking the mercy of the courts to allow me the right to die with dignity. It is cruel and inhumane to force me or any other Canadian to suffer a prolonged death.
So we had a new court case. Again, it went to a BC Supreme Court and won, but then it was appealed, and BC Court of Appeal, which is the highest court in BC, they lost. But of course, this was one of those cases. It was probably pretty clear from the start where this was headed, back to the Supreme Court of Canada. The basic arguments that they were making in front of these Supreme Court judges, it was basically the same. It's a discriminating against someone based on an ability, because if they cannot pull off the act physically of committing suicide, and this idea that subjecting somebody to the symptoms of an illness was inhumane. It was cruel and unusual punishment. But again, there was opposition from religious groups and from disability groups. So one of the lead lawyers on this case, Joe Arve, who's a very well-known constitutional lawyer, he did address this when speaking to the Supreme Court.
Now let me finally cut to the chase, to the heart of this appeal. The most vociferous opposition to our challenge comes from some church groups and some disabled organizations. To the disabled organizations, I say this: I would be the very last person to ever suggest that one is, quote, better off dead, quote, than being disabled.
Arve, you might kind of heard him suggest it there. Arve was a disabled person himself. Unfortunately, he's passed away since then, but he was a wheelchair user himself. So he did feel, I guess, positioned to speak directly to these issues and to these concerns. And, I heard him say, I'm always, on the same side of political issues as most of the, disability advocacy groups. And I think it did pain him that there was this opposition, but he like others before him, he was unwavering in his position on this. And, this time, as I think you probably know, they won. And so in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that the prohibition on assisted suicide in the Criminal Code of Canada was unconstitutional.
So we begin tonight with a seismic legal shift on an issue that could one day affect all of us. The Supreme Court has struck down the law banning doctor-assisted suicide. It means Canadians who are suffering unbearably at the end of life will have a choice about how they die.
So we're coming out of the 90s. We're in 2015 now, and in the 90s we had this 5-4 pretty close vote. To have a 5-4 case swing to 9-0.
The decisions can be revisited if there's a fundamental change in the parameters of debate. And this is what the judges said in their decision. They said that's exactly what happened. The social context has changed. Another big part of that was there was now precedent. Other countries had legalized assisted suicide. Some of the worst case scenarios that people had warned about hadn't borne out. So they felt, I think, a little bit more comfortable following these other countries and making this decision that this prohibition was unconstitutional.
But I do remember it was still a slow process before it was in place and available. What happened in those intervening years?
So I mean, when they made this ruling, it wasn't boom, it's legal now. The court gave the federal government a year to come up with a law and to pass it. At the time, Stephen Harper was the prime minister. Leader of the Conservative Party. We had a conservative government in Canada for a long time leading up to this, and they were not too keen about this. They did not like the decision. Part of their base is social conservatives. They, of course, didn't like this. So they seemed to kind of stall and equivocate and see if there's ways they could, get around this. But later that year, in 2015, there was an election. The Conservatives lost, and that's when Justin Trudeau and the Liberals came in. So they had, less time to get this done. They did ask the court for an extension. They asked for 6 months, and they did get 4. Eventually, after a bunch of wrangling back and forth, with the Senate, there was finally a bill, and that was C-14. And that was the bill that first legalized assisted suicide in Canada.
So this is Bill C-14. This is 2015, 2016. This was our first medical assistance in dying legislation as Canadians would come to know it.
But it was, still controversial, of course. And, there was a lot of people that felt, this was a bad thing, that, there too many people were going to die. But there was also a lot of people that felt that it was too restrictive. They didn't meet all the things that the court actually called for. The first medical assistance in dying law in Canada restricted it to people who were suffering intolerably and whose death was reasonably foreseeable. So basically, you're really sick, you're suffering, you're in a ton of pain, and you're set to die in the next 6 months. In that case, you can apply for MAID, and you're likely going to have a doctor help you die. When this law was first passed, as we said, there was a lot of people that felt that it didn't go far enough because it did exclude people who had medical conditions and who were, in pain or suffering from severe illness, but whose death was not reasonably foreseeable. So the government did promise, we're going to get to that. We're going to address that. We're going to study it and then potentially make changes. But in 2019, their hand was kind of forced because there was a ruling in Quebec. There was another lawsuit. 2 Montrealers sued, and they argued they both had medical conditions. They said that they were suffering intolerably, and they wanted access to MAID, but they did not qualify because their death was not, quote unquote, reasonably foreseeable. So they won that case, and that kind of forced the federal government to take this on again, to study it and to change the law. So they began looking at how to have the law include people like these two who sued, but also people like Madeline, for whom death was not considered by doctors to be, quote unquote, reasonably foreseeable.
Under the MAID criteria, I qualify under quality of life. And now, luckily, because the law has changed, and I do consider it luckily, that I don't have to wait for foreseeable death, because allopathic medicine won't recognize that I'm already in foreseeable death. I mean, come on, the cellular suffocation, that ain't good, And so, yeah, I mean, it's like if a diabetic didn't have insulin, they wouldn't be surprised if they were going to die. But with mine, like, well, you have a snuffleupagus. Like, it's an imaginary thing. You're not dying. You're just imagining it. Like, really? I'm imaginary dead? The maid doctors are having patients die imaginarily. Like, come on.
So this new law that would amend the original MAID law, it was called C7, and they began to debate it. It was going back and forth in the House of Commons, and it was also in front of a committee, the Justice Committee. And again, we had some very strong opposition from some disability groups. I want to play you this clip. It's from a University of Alberta professor. She's an ethics professor, and she's also the chair of a committee, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities Ending of Life Ethics Committee. So this is Dr. Heidi Jans, and this is when she was addressing the Justice Committee last year.
People with disabilities are at a higher risk of suicide due to systemic and internalized ableism. Yet they face substantial barriers when trying to access suicide prevention services. Medical professionals overlook typical sources of stress, problems arising from relationship breakdowns, depression, and isolation are wrongly attributed to disability. The removal of reasonably foreseeable natural death as a limiting eligibility criterion for the provision of MAID will result in people with disabilities seeking MAID as an ultimate capitulation to a lifetime of ableist oppression.
And so this committee, headed by Heidi Jans, they had a number of demands that they brought to these parliamentarians. Essentially what they're saying, okay, if you are going to expand it, you need to introduce all types of safeguards to make sure this isn't abused. They were saying, well, first things first, you got to make sure that these people with disabilities or illnesses or people under this new category seeking MAID have everything they need. So they need adequate housing. They need adequate home care and palliative care. And you should make the law say we have to make sure that these things are available to this person before they can get MAID. So another thing that Jans and others were calling for is that the government, they said they should require that all these discussions about MAID are patient-led. It has to be their idea. You can't have doctors bringing it up and suggesting or even pressuring patients into seeking MAID. This patient-led piece is really important. And you know, it was a number of disability groups here in Canada that were calling it. But there was also the UN that came into this, and they came out quite strongly in addressing this issue. So in 2019, the UN's Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came to Canada, and she kind of did like an audit of all of our disability issues and legislations and laws and structural ableism and stuff in Canada. And she devoted a whole section to MAID, and she said she was, quote, extremely concerned about the implementation of the legislation on medical assistance in dying from a disability perspective. So she goes on to say, you know, the people with disabilities, they've been provided this option of MAID, but not viable options for other things. And again, the UN spoke up again. This rapporteur, I think, left that job, but a number of other individuals at the UN wrote directly to the government when they began considering this new change to expand MAID to more people in Canada. I think you have that one in front of you, Ash.
From a disability rights perspective, there is a grave concern that if assisted dying is made available for all persons with a health condition or impairment, regardless of whether they are close to death, a social assumption might follow or be subtly reinforced that it is better to be dead than to live with a disability. Therefore, a major concern must be that persons with a disability, and perhaps especially those with newly acquired impairment, may opt too readily for assisted dying, based on the internalization of prejudices, fears, and low expectations of living with a disability, even before having the chance of coming to terms with and adapting to their new disability status.
These parliamentarians, they did hear all this testimony. Like I said, it was a tough one. I think the government requested and got four extensions from the court to pass this new law, but eventually they did. Finally, it became law in March of just this year, that Bill C7. So this new law removed that 10-day waiting period for terminally ill patients, for people for whom death is reasonably foreseeable. The report I was reading from earlier, it actually showed that a lot of the time that 10-day waiting period was waived. And I think most of the time that was because there was a concern that person would just die within that 10-day waiting period, but also that they would lose the ability to consent, that they would lose the mental capacity to consent. Maybe they'd, maybe not even be conscious or something. And it also reduced the number of impartial witnesses from 2 to 1. It actually also removed this bit that required final consent. But that's for those terminally ill patients. This new category is more restrictive.
This is the category that Madeline falls
Yes,
into.
the ones for whom suffering is quote unquote intolerable, but for whom death is not reasonably foreseeable. So there's a 90-day waiting period, and as we've said before, that is what Madeline is in right now. She is in that 90-day waiting period, waiting to have made available to her. But there is also something, and this is sort of follows what some of those advocates were calling for. There is a requirement that the doctor at least speaks to them about alternatives, palliative care, mental health services, and disability supports.
Please do just listen to episode 3 if you want to get a sense of what the government says is available. But none of it, I think we also lay out pretty clearly that none of it is meeting the needs, especially of severe ME/CFS patients. It will likely fall short in meeting the needs of long-haul COVID patients. And specifically, what Madeline needs is treatment. So that would be coverage for healthcare provisions, healthcare providers, actual appointments, and the administration of her treatments. In BC, those on paper and in reality, what you get is $23.50 per treatment. So, and 10 of those treatments. And you have to spread those treatments among all healthcare practitioners outside of medical doctors. So you are fully covered with your MSP for every doctor's visit. But should you go to a massage therapist, a chiropractor, a physiotherapist, a naturopath, an acupuncturist, $23.50 per session for 10 sessions. So $235 a year. That is not even, I mean, when I go to a physiotherapist, it is a minimum $80 fee. So it doesn't even cover the schedule of fees for these practitioners. And then, as you've rightly pointed out, Madeline receives around $1,300 a month, and that's a single person's disability assistance. It's not a question of whether these are adequate. They are inadequate. People are dying because they can't access the supports financially.
We have universal health care that deals best with emergent situations, emergencies, but complex chronic illness, disability, hell, even aging. No, there's a huge lack going on. And this feeling during Corona that, oh, it's okay if the older people die. Really? I don't want to die. You don't have the right to take that away from me. Each day is precious. And that I keep trying to say this, that I'm pursuing MAID doesn't mean I've given up on hope. I'm positive until the reality of the situation is that there's no possible solution. That's what MAID is. It's not suicide. It's not giving up. And it's not being not positive. That's my situation with MAID. I'm faced with a system that won't hear me. I'm faced with a society that shrugs its shoulders and thinks that PWD is just sitting around eating bonbons and watching TV.
You did talk to somebody else about this, right? The NDP MP from Manitoba?
Yeah, so his name is Daniel Blakey, and I reached out to him because there's this petition, this e-petition before the House of Commons right now, specifically asking for more funding and research and attention to be given to ME/CFS.
How did you first hear of ME/CFS, as we call it? What was your first sort of, contact with this disorder?
Sure. I mean, it came pretty much along with the request to sponsor the petition. Although it was something that I was beginning to hear about in the context of the pandemic, and particularly so-called long COVID or from COVID long haulers who are experiencing many of the same symptoms as people experience who are affected by this syndrome. And so as that becomes a larger and larger issue that affects more people, this is something that I think Canada, as well as many places around the world, are going to have to reckon with, because it really means that people don't experience the kind of typical recovery, or I think actually what we need to learn is that there are typical recoveries that don't involve a kind of fixed timeline and people heading back to work within a limited period of time.
But our conversation pretty quickly switched to entrenched poverty and to the, I guess, efforts made by the federal opposition, the New Democratic Party, to increase supports, perhaps even get a universal basic income out there for people with disabilities.
Nobody in Canada should be faced with death by poverty, and yet it's something that's happening all the time. Canada has the resources to be able to make sure that people can live with dignity and respect, whether they're able to work or not.
And the opening up of medical assistance in dying, which happened pretty rapidly in the last year, that actually, led to the government once again promising that they're going to ensure that these alternatives to MAID are in place. He doesn't feel that's happening.
And we're very much of the view as New Democrats that government should be acting on those things with the same amount of urgency and in as timely a way as they were willing to act on the court decisions around medical assistance in dying. In fact, those things really ought to have gone hand in hand. That was part of our appeal back in December, was to the government to say, look, let's get proper income support for people living with disabilities in place on the same timetable that the government was looking to pass the legislation on medical assistance in dying, to provide some real assurance to Canadians that support was going to be there and people wouldn't be put in the awful position that Madeline finds herself. So that we can avoid those terrible stories and avoid doing that to people. So that's why we think the government really needs to be acting with a sense of urgency on this. It's why we were, frankly, bitterly disappointed when the budget came out and they announced a 3-year consultation on a new federal disability benefit. That's clearly not acting with the same level of urgency that they were on the other issues. And then just today, they tabled an act that is apparently, or was being billed as a new disability benefit. But if you look at the act, it's just a placeholder. There's no information about eligibility. There's no information about the amount of the benefit. So it's really, it's just kind of a talking point. It's not a real bill.
Yeah, and of course, this all relates back to Madeline. In this podcast, Madeline has always been at the center of it, and that's our intention, but it's also trying to show you that she's not alone, and that the issues that she faces reach so much farther in every direction. This has all been, obviously really heavy, but we want to, remember that, we don't want to represent Madeline in the same way that Judge represented Tracy, right? She's not just this, this ball of misery and suffering, and we want to keep reminding you of her humanity and her value and how much she loves her community and her friends and how much that love is returned, if not by the government and the systems, then by the people who know her.
It's really hard for me to feel like I'm begging for my life on the internet. But more than all of that, maybe it serves another purpose, because my story is anyone's story. Like, what happened to me can happen to anyone. A person's current health or your current financial situation does not protect you from becoming me. We are all, as humans, vulnerable. We are all mortal. And I think a lot of things that go on in the world are fruit of the poisonous tree of a fear to look that in the eye. And it's hella scary. I say that by going, it's scary, but it's also super rewarding, because you then have to cherish every moment. And I wonder, if we all understood that we're all vulnerable, would we learn to become better communicators? Would we refrain from the kind of encampments that we get into that breed racism and sexism and all kinds of different other kinds of hate?
So where do we go from here? As you might have picked up from MP Blakey's comments, there's a universal disability income law on the table federally, but it was only put forward by the Liberal government in the final days before the House of Commons took its summer break. And a lot of people feel like it's a bit of a smokescreen. Plus, it's unlikely it will ever be in place in a meaningful way in time to help Madeline. We'll be back in 2 weeks with as many answers as we can dredge up. In the meantime, you can find transcripts for each episode and links to Madeline's GoFundMe campaign, Madeline's Miracle, on our website, IamMadeline.com, and on our Twitter feed, @IamMadelinePod. You can access our bonus episodes through our Patreon page, where you can sign up to support independent creators and get access to their exclusive content. Thanks to our newest Patreon supporters, Stephanie, Christine, and another person out there named Ash. Go to patreon.com/umbrellapodcasting to support the show. I Am Madeline is written and recorded on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh,